Okay, the first two problems on our list are M51 and M52. They go pretty quickly, so I'm just going to do them both together. Each of these problems matches you with an item, and then you have to match it with the definition. And the first one, they call it a players. And the second one, they talk about the fraud triangle, and they discuss the three elements of that, and then says, what does Sarbanes-Oxley do to prevent that? So on the first one, let's look at number one, independent auditors. Independent auditors would be CPAs who examine financial statements to attest to their fairness. Remember that independent auditors, their ultimate goal is to express an opinion on the financial statements about whether or not they are materially in accordance with the rules and principles of accounting. That materiality concept is important to auditors. Auditors can't look at all the transactions or all the items of the financial statements. It's not time feasible for them to do so. They have to usually give their opinion within a few months, and if you're looking at a year's worth of transactions, obviously the time difference doesn't translate. But they do look at what's important to the users of the financial statements, that word being material, and provide reasonable assurance that the financial statements are correct. They give their opinion, either it would be considered a qualified, an unqualified, or adverse opinion. They can also issue a disclaimer report, and a disclaimer report would be where they disassociate themselves with the financial statements, indicating that they were unable to complete the audit for some reason. The next one, external users. External users are letter A, investors and creditors, among others. We talked about investors and creditors all the way back in chapters 1, maybe chapters 2, but we built onto that in this chapter. We talked about government, and there's two components of government that I wanted you to know about that would be interested in using the financial statements, the SEC as well as the IRS, and what their purposes is. Remember, the SEC dictates part of the powers that were given to it to other committees, if you will, or other groups, such as the FASB, the FASB, who establish accounting principles and rules, and the PCAOB, which SOX created, Sarbanes-Oxley being SOX, created the PCAOB, and SEC has allowed the PCAOB to now dictate auditing standards. The other group, though, that I wanted to mention to you that we talked about in Chapter 5 would be the Board of Directors, which brings us to the third item here. So the third item says directors, and this would be letter B, people who are elected by the stockholders to oversee companies' management. Remember, with the directors or the board of directors, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the investors to make sure that they're looking out for their best interest. Okay? On M52, it asks us, what does SOX do to reduce different characteristics within the fraud triangle? So if we look at the first one, it says establish a tip line for employees to report questionable acts. This would be letter C, which is the rationalized portion of the fraud triangle. Remember, in this fraud triangle here, for the rationalized portion, in order for a fraud to take place and then actually stay hidden, an individual has to be able to rationalize their actions or the actions that they know about. This first one here says that they establish a hotline or a tip line. With that, I want you to understand that an individual may be withholding information because they rationalize it in their head that I don't have an outlet, I don't have a place to give this information to. Establishing a tip line, it eliminates, and this would be the rationalized section over here, it eliminates that rationalization, that thought, right? Number 2 says increase maximum fines to $5 million. This would be letter A, incentive. The incentive, or sometimes pressure, is what we might call it, is the first component of the fraud triangle. In order for a fraud to take place, there has to be a reason why the fraud took place. Either it's incentive or pressure, and you might think that someone just feeling like it isn't a reason, but it might be an incentive, it might be a pressure, and we can at least categorize it that way. Because some individuals, as we'll look at when we look at the Enron movie or talk about the Enron scandal, some individuals just want to see if they can get away with it, just want to see if they're smarter than the system. Can they beat the system? You might might call that egotistical or whatever, but that can be an incentive and pressure. And then in number 2, it says they increase the maximum fines to $5 million. In this instance, they're trying to disincentivize the employees or the managers or whatnot, whoever's perpetrating the fraud, from actually committing it. So they'd have to have a higher incentive or a higher pressure in order to actually commit the fraud, when the fines can be up to $5 million or 20 years in jail, right? Then if you just want to see if you're smart enough to get away with it, it might not be enough of an incentive or enough of a pressure to get you to commit the fraud. 3 says require management to report on the effectiveness of internal control. This will be the second section, the opportunity fraud triangle portion, and that would be letter, let's see what letter it is, B. And what this indicates when it tells us that they require management to report on the effectiveness of internal control, they're trying to make management aware of the loopholes or the gaps that might exist in their internal control environment. They're trying to make them aware of where fraud could take place and thereby reduce the opportunities that might exist to fraud perpetrators. The next one, 4, says legislate whistleblower protection. That would be rationalization, letter C. In terms of rationalization, again, remember, on the first one we talked about, right here, we established a hotline or an outlet for someone to actually tell others what they know or tell others if they committed a fraud. The whistleblower protection here, this would be another step in stopping a rationalization thought process that might think, well, if I tell someone, I'm going to lose my job. So they rationalize in their head, hey, I'm not going to tell anyone what I know about this fraud or that I committed this fraud. I'm afraid that if I tell someone, I will lose my job or be negatively reflected. Now, if you committed the fraud, you're still going to have negative consequences. But if you're just knowing about the fraud, but you're rationalizing that you can't talk about it because you don't want to lose your job, or you're afraid people might look negatively on you for making the company be seen in a bad light, right? This whistleblower protection, protecting those who make others alert to the fraud, is a step to reduce that rationalization. The last one is require an external auditor's report on internal control effectiveness. This would be B. Again, B, so A, B, and C here for parts of the fraud triangle. So what this one is not only does management, up here on number 3, we said management has to be aware of the internal control environment, be aware of the internal controls in place, and comment on whether or not they're operating effectively, but also an outside party, external auditors outside the company, they also have to comment on whether or not internal controls are operating effectively, that they're designed appropriately, and that they're in place in the company. Again, trying to limit the opportunities that fraud perpetrators might have. Okay? If you have any questions on either of these 2 problems, feel free to email me, and that's M51, M52.